The silver goblet gleamed so brightly that Rowan Hale could see her own fear twisted in its curved surface. It looked like a gift fit for royalty, polished to perfection and engraved with winter wolves and frost vines. But the dread inside her said otherwise. She knew, with the cold certainty that only terror could bring, that the cup in Lady Seraphine Voss's hand was not a blessing. It was a sentence. The great hall stood silent beneath its towering stone arches. Nobles lined both sides of the chamber in embroidered furs and jewels, their attention fixed on Rowan, as if they had finally been handed the humiliation they had long wanted to witness. She stood in plain grey wool before the throne, every inch of her painfully aware of how little she belonged there. Lady Seraphine's smile never touched her eyes. Her expression held the elegance of a queen and the cruelty of a blade. She extended the goblet with calculated grace, offering it publicly, forcing Rowan into a choice that was no choice at all. Refusal would be an insult. Acceptance could mean death. Above them all, King Grayson Vale watched from the throne of black ironwood and pale glacial stone. He did not move. He did not speak. His stillness was more frightening than rage. His silver, gray eyes held the scene with the cold focus of a hunter, and Rowan's heart pounded harder with every second he remained silent. She could not tell whether he expected her to obey, resist, or break. Her fingers trembled at her sides as she reached toward the goblet. The room felt too still, too sharp, too aware. Every noble waited. Every servant held their breath. Every piece of warmth had drained from the air. Then the atmosphere changed. A dark pressure rolled through the hall like a storm gathering behind the walls. It was not sound at first, but something deeper, something felt through bone and stone. The torchlight near the throne bent strangely, as if the darkness beneath the king had become alive. Rowan barely had time to register the shift before a massive spectral shape tore itself from the king's shadow. The beast looked like a wolf formed from smoke, frost, and old fury. It lunged with impossible speed, slamming into the silver goblet before Rowan's fingertips could close around it. The cup flew from Lady Seraphine's hand and crashed across the stone floor, spinning wildly. A stream of black liquid splashed from its mouth and struck the flagstones. The poison hissed on contact. Green smoke rose from the floor as the stone itself began to corrode. The sour scent of blackroot spread through the hall, thick and unmistakable. It was not suspicion anymore. It was proof. Shock shattered the room. Lady Seraphine's polished mask cracked, exposing a flash of naked rage. Rowan remained frozen where she stood, her hand half lifted, her eyes dragged back to the throne. King Grayson had not moved. The shadow wolf dissolved into nothing, folding back into his stillness as though it had never existed. Yet something in his eyes had changed. Rowan saw no triumph there, no satisfaction, only a fierce and startled recognition, as if some buried part of him had acted his mind could catch up. The hall had just witnessed treason. But Rowan's world had fractured for a different reason. Because the king's beast had not protected the kingdom. It had protected her. And as the silence split under the weight of that truth, the memory of how everything began rose up like a ghost from 3 months earlier. 3 months before poison touched the throne room floor, Rowan had still believed she was the most worthless girl in the north. Before the poisoned cup, before the king's shadow moved for her, Rowan Hale had belonged to the kind of life people survived without ever truly escaping. She was not born in the fortress of Frostmere. But she had been sent there like damaged cargo, traded by a father who considered her a stain on his bloodline and a burden best removed. He had not sold her for wealth. That would have at least made her feel valuable. He had traded her away as part of a minor pact, exchanging her future as if she were no more meaningful than salted meat or winter grain. By the time she arrived in the northern stronghold, Rowan already knew what the world believed about her. She was barren. Weak. A girl with no magic in a land where bloodlines were measured by power. The servants' quarters in Frostmere were narrow, drafty, and always cold. She spent her days in the scullery with her arms buried in icy water, scrubbing grease from heavy kettles until her fingers cracked and blood. Steam never stayed warm for long. Soap bit into her skin. Her shoulders ached. Her stomach was never full. Her existence blended into the rhythm of labor, until she felt less like a person and more like part of the fortress machinery. The other servants knew who she was. That only made them crueler. There was a special pleasure people took in watching someone born to rank fall lower than they had ever stood. They whispered behind her back. They made sure she heard words like ruined, cursed, useless. Rowan learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less visible. It was safer that way. But she carried one secret. In a broken courtyard behind a disused western wall, where winter wind whistled through cracked stone and old planters lay half, Rowan had found a single dying seedling. It should not have survived. The soil there was long dead, sored by frost and neglect. The castle gardeners had abandoned it years ago. Yet the tiny stem still clung to life with stubborn defiance. Something about it called to her. Every night, after the kitchens quieted and the halls emptied, Rowan slipped out to that forgotten corner with a scrap of stolen warmth and the little hope she had left. She loosened the frozen dirt with raw fingers. She carried bits of water warmed near the cooking fires. She knelt in the snow and pressed her hands into the earth, as though her own loneliness might somehow nourish it. She never understood why she kept returning. Maybe because that weak little plant mirrored something inside her. Maybe because if it lived, she could pretend that broken things were not always meant to die where they had been discarded. Above the fortress, the season deepened. Rumors spread through the halls like frost along a window pane. The High King of the North was coming. Grayson Vale, ruler of the Winter Territories, ancient by mortal standards and feared by allies and enemies alike, would soon arrive for a summit meant to prevent open war among the northern packs and southern borders. Even the scullery shook with the tension of it. Rowan's dread sharpened when she learned one more detail. Her father would also attend. The man who had branded her life with shame would be under the same roof again, surrounded by men who respected his title and ignored his cruelty. Rowan felt the old fear return immediately, cold and familiar, crawling through her chest like smoke. From that moment on, she worked harder to disappear. But the fortress was changing around her. Floors were polished, tapestries aired, guards doubled in the halls. Every corner of Frostmere prepared itself for the arrival of a king. And Rowan, the invisible servant girl no one bothered to look at, had no idea that the first step toward destroying her old life would begin not in the throne room, but beside a dying plant in a ruined courtyard. On the night she begged a dead patch of earth to keep one fragile thing alive. The most dangerous man in the kingdom saw her. The courtyard was wrapped in twilight and silence when Rowan slipped outside that evening. The summit had already filled Frostmere with tension, and her father's presence in the fortress had made every hallway feel too narrow to breathe in. The only place that still felt even remotely hers was the ruined planter beneath the broken stone arch. The seedling looked worse than it ever had. Its lone leaf had darkened at the edges, curled inward like a hand giving up. The sight hit Rowan harder than it should have. She had spent weeks pouring scraps of comfort into this one living thing, and now even that small promise seemed ready to vanish. The despair she had buried all day rose too quickly to stop. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her bare hands pressed into the frozen dirt despite the pain. She leaned over the planter as if protecting it from the world. Her breathing shook. Her heart ached with a grief larger than the dying plant in front of her. Everything in her life had always been taken before it had the chance to grow. She had learned to expect loss, but somehow this tiny fragile thing had become sacred. Something in her broke open then. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly, the way ice cracks beneath deep pressure. A strange warmth stirred in the center of her chest, unlike anything she had ever felt before. It spread down her arms and pooled in her hands, gentle but alive. Rowan closed her eyes and let every desperate part of herself pour into that patch of earth. She did not think of magic. She did not think of miracles. She only thought of survival. When the voice behind her cut through the cold, she nearly collapsed from shock. King Grayson Vale stood a few steps away, alone beneath the evening sky, dark fur draped over his broad shoulders, silver, gray eyes fixed not on her face but on the planter box itself. He looked less like a man and more like winter given shape. The air around him seemed sharper, cleaner, almost watchful. Rowan scrambled to her feet, panic burning through her. A servant caught alone, out of place, touching abandoned royal grounds in the middle of a political summit. There were a dozen ways the moment could end badly. Yet the king did not look angry. He looked intent. His gaze returned to the seedling. The leaf had changed. What had been blackened only moments ago now carried a faint green along its edge. It was barely visible, but unmistakable. The dying stem stood a little straighter. Rowan stared at it in disbelief, unable to explain what she had done or whether she had truly done anything at all. The king saw it too. Something silent passed across his face then, something old and searching. He stepped closer, and Rowan felt that same strange pressure she had sensed in the throne room months later. a deep awareness gathering around him, as though the force inside him had suddenly turned all its attention toward her. He studied her with unnerving calm. Not as a servant, not as a woman, not even as a problem. He looked at her as if she were an answer to a question he had been carrying for years. By the time he turned away, her fate had already changed. The next morning, orders spread through the household with the speed of scandal. Rowan Hale was being removed from the kitchens and reassigned to the king's private household. No explanation followed. None was offered to the servants. None was given to the nobles. It happened reached down from the highest tower and lifted her clean out of her old life. Her father was furious. The court was suspicious. The servants were vicious with jealousy. And Rowan, now moved into a small clean room near the royal wing, understood only one thing with certainty. The king had seen something in her beside that dead soil. And whatever it was, it had just dragged her into the center of a world she was never meant to survive. As Rowan stepped across the threshold of the royal wing, she still did not know whether the king had rescued her from one prison or delivered her into another. Life in the royal wing was gentler than the kitchens, but far more dangerous in ways Rowan had never imagined. Her room contained a real bed, a wool blanket thick enough to hold warmth through the night, and a narrow window overlooking the snow-laden peaks beyond Frostmere. To anyone else, it might have looked like mercy. To Rowan, it felt like being placed under glass. Her duties were vague. She delivered the king's tea in the early mornings, arranged papers in his study, carried correspondence when ordered, and spent long hours standing quietly at the edges of rooms where power moved like a blade beneath velvet. She was never asked to scrub floors anymore. She was never struck. She was never starved. But she was always watched. King Grayson did not speak often. Most days he seemed carved from the same cold permanence as the fortress itself. Delegations moved in and out of his study with grim faces. Maps were spread over tables. Letters arrived with broken seals and bad news. Every hour of the summit thickened with strategy, threats, and shifting loyalties. Rowan saw enough to understand that the kingdom stood on the edge of fracture. Yet amid all that pressure, the king's attention continued returning to her. He never made a spectacle of it. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, his focus came in fragments: a pause too long when she entered a room, a glance that landed on her hands when she touched a withering vine in the glasshouse, a quiet stillness whenever she stood near old stone or living things. He treated her with a gravity that made the nobles furious and Rowan herself deeply uneasy. The court reacted exactly as cruelty always did when it sensed weakness close to power. Whispers followed her through the corridors. Some called her the kitchen stray. Others said she was a passing obsession, a foolish indulgence, a servant lifted too high by the king's temporary curiosity. Lady Seraphine Voss, brilliant and socially untouchable, made her contempt clear without ever needing to raise her voice. Every look from her felt like an accusation. Still, the most unsettling moments happen in private. Late at night, when the fortress slept and the formal demands of rulership loosened their grip, Rowan sometimes found the king in the places where she hid from the court's scorn. The old library, the glass gardens, the silent halls lined with forgotten histories. He would appear without warning, watching her as she read books she had no right to touch or trailed her fingers across leaves that should have been dead by winter. Those moments were not romantic in the simple sense. They were stranger than that. Charged. Searching. He seemed less interested in claiming her than in understanding why the world itself shifted around her presence. In the glasshouse, long, failing plants began to hold their color when she passed by them. In the courtyard, the stubborn seedlings she had nearly mourned now carried too strong leaves. Even Rowan could no longer dismiss the pattern. Something inside her responded to life and earth with a tenderness that changed them both. The king noticed everything, and gradually Rowan noticed something too. For all his power, for all the fear he inspired, Grayson Vale carried a loneliness so deep it seemed to echo through the halls behind him. The kingdom obeyed him. The nobles needed him. The warriors feared him, but none of them reached him. He ruled from the center of a frozen world and remained untouched by it. That realization softened something dangerous in Rowan. The bond between them was still unspoken, still undefined. But it was growing through silence, through observation. Through those strange moments when it felt as though the king recognized in her the one thing his world had been missing. And outside those private spaces, the pressure around them was beginning to close. Political alliances were hardening. Her father had begun speaking more often with Lady Seraphine. Noble families circled the throne with proposals sharpened into traps. The rumors in the fortress no longer focused only on Rowan's presence. They focused on what she was preventing. Because if the king chose a servant girl over a powerful alliance, the cost might not fall on him alone. It might fall on the entire kingdom. By the time Rowan understood that she had become the obstacle standing between the throne and peace, the court had already begun planning how to remove her. The trap closed slowly, then all at once, by the height of the summit, Frostmere no longer felt like a fortress holding negotiations. It felt like a battlefield dressed in silk and silver. Every council session ended with harder faces. Every meal in the Great Hall carried the tension of a knife waiting to be drawn. Rowan, once beneath notice, had become the unspoken subject of every whispered conversation. Lady Seraphine Voss and Rowan's father, Everett Hale, made their strategy obvious to anyone willing to see it. They did not attack the king directly. They offered him what rulers were expected to value most: stability, military strength, secured borders, and a marriage alliance strong enough to quiet half the north. Seraphine's family would bind itself to the throne through blood. Everett's territory would reinforce the pact. Together they promised enough force to prevent war. The price was never formally spoken in open court, but Rowan felt it everywhere. She was the stain on the arrangement, the servant girl in the royal wing, the embarrassing fascination, the living reminder that the king's attention had drifted somewhere politically unacceptable. If Grayson accepted the alliance, Rowan would need to disappear, sent away, return to her father, cast back into hunger and obscurity, perhaps worse. The possibility settled over her like a slow suffocation. The king became harder to read with each passing day. He still ruled with cold precision. He still commanded every room without effort. But the private spaces where he had once found her grew empty. He stopped appearing in the library. He no longer lingered in the gardens. The invisible thread between them pulled thin with strain. Rowan understood why, and that understanding hurt more than anger would have. He was a king. Kings did not belong to themselves, so she began preparing quietly for the end. She folded her few belongings. She tried not to let hope poison her more deeply than disappointment already had. The memory of his attention became something too fragile to touch directly. For a short time, he had made her feel visible. That alone had changed her enough to make the coming loss unbearable. Then the summons came. She was ordered to the great hall in her plainest decent dress, her hair pinned neatly, her expression lowered into obedience. The entire court had gathered by the time she arrived. Nobles lined the chamber in expectant silence. Her father stood near the front, satisfaction gleaming through his carefully arranged composure. Lady Seraphine wore white and silver, radiant and untouchable. At the far end of the hall, King Grayson sat on the throne with his face carved into unreadable calm. Rowan knew instantly what this was meant to be. A public renunciation. A clean break. A ceremony of humiliation staged for political convenience. The kind of moment courts enjoyed because it transformed private pain into entertainment. The air itself seemed to tighten when Lady Seraphine stepped forward, carrying the silver goblet. She offered it with ceremonial grace, wrapping malice in elegance, extending death beneath the language of welcome. Rowan felt the danger before she understood it. Her body knew before her mind did. Still she reached. And the world split open. The king's shadow became a beast. The goblet flew. Poison burned through stone. Treason filled the hall like smoke. Every hidden intention was suddenly visible, and no one in that chamber could pretend otherwise. But the greatest shock did not come from the poison. It came from the king, because once the hall fell silent and the truth lay hissing on the floor, Grayson Vale rose from the throne at last. The cold mask was gone. What stood in its place was fury sharpened by something far more personal than politics. And when he crossed the hall toward Rowan, everyone present understood that the alliance they had built on her ruin had just failed. What happened next did not save the kingdom from war. It chose Rowan in front of the entire court and made war inevitable. The great hall, already stunned by the poison, seemed to lose all breath when King Grayson descended from the throne. He did not look at Lady Seraphine first. He did not look at Everett Hale. His attention fixed entirely on Rowan, as if every noble in the room had suddenly ceased to matter. Only after crossing half the chamber did he turn his gaze toward the conspirators. His authority struck the hall like thunder. Guards moved before anyone had time to process the order. Steel flashed from its scabbards. Nobles recoiled. The illusion of diplomacy collapsed in a single instant. Treason was no longer a whisper or suspicion. It stood exposed in green smoke and corroded stone. Everett protested first, not with fear but with outrage. Rowan saw the disbelief on his face before it curdled into hatred. He had expected her removal, not her protection. He had expected the king to choose territory, armies, and political advantage. Instead, Grayson made his position unmistakable. He chose her. Not privately. Not with hesitation. Before the court, before rival houses, before every witness who might carry the news across the north, he treated Rowan as something precious enough to defend at the cost of alliances. In that one irreversible moment, she ceased to be a servant hidden in the royal wing. She became the fracture line beneath the kingdom. Chaos followed. Lady Seraphine's supporters shouted. Loyal guards clashed with hired blades. Nobles scrambled backward as the great hall erupted into violence. Amid the confusion, Grayson reached Rowan and closed a hand around hers. His grip was cold, firm, and absolute. He pulled her through the turmoil with the efficiency of a man who had already accepted the consequences of his choice. He did not take her to his chambers. He took her upward, through narrow stairs and old passages, past levels of the fortress Rowan had never seen, until they reached a tower chamber high above Frostmere. It was built of ancient stone and reinforced with iron bands thick enough to withstand siege. A narrow bed stood near the wall. A single window overlooked the valley. The room felt secure, severe, and terribly alone. Grayson's focus moved over her face, her hands, her throat, as though checking for harm he had arrived too late to prevent. There was something raw in his expression now, something that stripped the distance from him and left only urgency. Yet even in that urgency, he still did what kings had always done. He decided for her. He told her she would be safe there. He promised no one would reach her. He gave the order with the certainty of a ruler safeguarding what mattered most. Then he turned and left. Because battles still raged below and rebellion had already begun to spread through the fortress. The heavy bar fell into place from the outside. Safety became captivity in a single sound. The hours that followed blurred into fear. Rowan heard shouting in the distance, boots in corridors, the ring of steel carried upward through the stones. Food came through silent guards who refused to meet her eyes. She stood at the narrow window and watched smoke rise from the lower courtyards, while the man who had chosen her fought an entire political collapse beyond her reach. Protection felt too much like a prison to be comforting. Then Gregor, the king's grim senior commander, arrived at her door with news worse than war. Everett Hale and his remaining allies had seized a hostage in the lower cells, a child from the kitchen quarters named Finn, a quiet orphan Rowan had once fed in secret. The boy was ill, fading fast, and being used as leverage. Her father demanded what he had always demanded from her: life surrender, obedience, and proof that her heart could be weaponized against her. The king had forbidden any exchange. He would not trade Rowan for anyone. For the first time since the tower door had closed, her fear changed shape. It was no longer only fear for herself, or even for Grayson. It became guilt. Because somewhere below, an innocent child might die simply because the king had chosen to save her. Alone in the tower while war spread beneath her feet, Rowan realized the only way to save Finn might lie in the strange power she had never dared to name. Despair stripped Rowan down to the truth of herself. The tower chamber felt smaller with every passing hour. Outside the narrow window, the sky darkened over Frostmere and the fortress bells rang with the urgency of men still fighting below. But none of that mattered as much as the image fixed in Rowan's mind: Finn alone in a dungeon cell, feverish and frightened, being used by cruel people who understood exactly where to place the blade. She could not pace away the helplessness. She could not reason with it. She could not survive it by shrinking the way she had survived everything else. At last she sank to the floor beside the wall and pressed both palms against the ancient stone. The mountain, cold surface met her skin like the memory of every hard thing she had ever endured. Yet beneath that cold she sensed something else, faint but waiting. It reminded her of the ruined courtyard, of the seedling, of the strange warmth that had once flowed through her hands when she had begged life not to die in frozen earth. This time she did not resist it. She closed her eyes and let the guilt, terror, hope, and stubborn love she felt for that small boy gather into a single desperate need. Not a command. Not a spell. A plea deeper than language. The warmth came back at once, rising from somewhere buried inside her chest, and spilling down her arms with greater force than ever before. It was not fire. It was not lightning. It was life itself, steady, green, golden, patient, and impossibly strong. The stone answered. Rowan felt it beneath her hands, first as a hum, then as a vast network waking from sleep. The fortress was no longer dead architecture. It was connected, rooted, aware. Every wall and floor and pillar became part of one ancient living body. And Rowan stood at its center like a pulse finding its heart. She followed that connection downward through layers of cold rock, through corridors she had never walked, through hidden passages and old foundations. She found the tiny faltering spark of life in the dark below. His fever burned weakly. His breath frayed. He was slipping. Rowan reached for him with everything she had. Warmth poured through the stone as if the mountain itself carried her will. She felt the current find the child, wrap around him, steady him. She pushed no violence into the world, only healing, deep, gentle, undeniable. Breath strengthened. Fever eased. The flickering light that was Finn grew steadier, fuller, safer. Rowan knelt there shaking as life moved through her, like a river too large for one body to contain. By the time she opened her eyes, her hands were faintly glowing in the dim room. That was when the tower door burst open. King Grayson stood there in blood-marked armor, chest rising hard, silver, gray eyes wide not with fear but awe. He stared first at her hands, then at the stone around her, as if he too had felt the fortress awaken. Dirt and battle still clung to him, yet the distance he had kept for weeks was gone. In its place stood a man who finally understood the truth that had been gathered around her from the beginning. Rowan was not a mistake in his court. She was the missing force his kingdom had been starving for. In her, winter had found its buried spring. But there was no time to absorb what that meant. Grayson told her the rebels still held the lower dungeon line. Everett had sworn Finn would die the moment the royal guard breached the cell by force. The old path to the boy was trapped. Every second mattered. Rowan looked at the stone beside the doorway and understood something terrifying and beautiful all at once. The fortress did not need to be stormed. It could be asked. As the king watched her place her glowing hand against the wall, Rowan prepared to give something no ruler, warrior, or sorcerer in Frostmere had ever imagined possible. The wall answered Rowan like water answering the moon. With her palm flat against the stone, she felt the fortress gather around her, immense and old and listening. Grayson stood at her side with the stillness of a man witnessing prophecy become real. Beyond the room, royal guards waited for an order that no longer fit the shape of the moment. Weapons could not solve what lived beneath the mountain. Rowan pushed gently. A deep grinding tremor moved through the tower and down into the lower halls. It was not the sound of destruction. It was the sound of ancient stone making room for the heart it recognized at last. Far below, beside the dungeon cell where Everett Hale held his final desperate line, the wall withdrew into itself and opened a silent new passage. The royal guard entered from behind. The rebellion ended in minutes. Everett barely had time to turn before Grayson reached him. Lady Seraphine's remaining allies fell just as fast, their plot shattered not by superior numbers alone, but by the impossible fact of the fortress itself turning against them. In the cell, Finn slept peacefully on a rough cot, his fever broken, his fragile life no longer balanced on the edge of loss. By the time Rowan arrived below, escorted through the newly opened passage, the fighting had ended. Chains replaced threats. The men who had built their ambitions on cruelty now stood stripped of power, stunned by a miracle they could neither control nor deny. But Rowan's attention went first to Finn. The child breathed evenly, color restored to his cheeks, the fear of the night already easing from his face. Relief hit her so hard it nearly dropped her where she stood. All the shame she had carried for years, the worthlessness, the rejection, the belief that she existed only to be discarded, cracked under the simple truth that she had saved a life. Not by accident, not because someone stronger intervened for her, because power had lived in her all along. When she looked up again, Grayson was watching her with a reverence so raw it made the air between them feel sacred. This time there was no distance left, no politics hard enough to stand between what they both knew. He moved toward her through the aftermath of chains, guards, and fallen schemes as though the rest of the world had already faded into irrelevance. In front of everyone gathered there, he honored her not as a servant, not as a protected secret, and not as a scandal he had chosen despite reason. He honored her as the force that had restored breath, hope, and life to a kingdom built on cold stone. The loneliness that had once shadowed him was gone. In its place stood certainty. The weeks that followed reshaped the North. Everett Hale and Lady Seraphine were stripped of land, title and influence, cast out examples of what treachery earned in Frostmere. The war that had threatened to ignite across the territories cooled before it could spread. News of Rowan's power traveled faster than fear. The packs that had once measured value only in dominance now faced something older and harder to oppose, a queen bound to the living heart of the mountain itself. Spring arrived 3 months later with a force no one in the kingdom could remember seeing. Flowers erupted across courtyards long buried under frost. The glass gardens, once fading toward death, glowed with impossible green. Vines climbed warm stone. Trees budded along the valley walls. Frostmere no longer felt like a kingdom enduring winter. It felt alive. Rowan stood one morning on the same tower balcony that had once held her prisoner and looked down over a transformed world. Finn laughed in the courtyard below, healthy now, chasing a young wolf pup through the new grass. Grayson stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her with a calm possessiveness that no longer felt like a cage. It felt like home. The girl who had once knelt in dead soil believing she was nothing had become the woman the mountain answered. And the king who had ruled through ice had finally found the one soul capable of teaching his kingdom how to bloom again. Far beyond Frostmere's thawing borders, older powers were beginning to stir, and if the mountain had awakened for Rowan, it had done so for a reason the kingdom had yet to understand.